Well, good morning, youth. We've been talking about how there is a big story in this universe and how we have little stories that fit inside that big story. And this is kind of like when Merry and Pippin have to find their place in the story of the Lord of the Rings. There's a big story going on in those novels. And those two men had to figure out how they fit their own little stories into that big story. And on Wednesday, we talked about how Lewis is doing this, in a sense, with the Narnia Chronicles. He's not making up some great, grand, huge work of literature that has all the technical superiority to it that Tolkien's books do. He's telling us the Christian story in an imaginative way, from a different perspective. He's telling it to us using an imaginative world so that we can understand the Christian story better and how it fits in the real world. He's doing that because he knows that just giving us propositional truth isn't always enough. Sometimes we need to imagine ourselves as a part of it. And we do that best by seeing the stories of others and how they live it out. But before we start talking about the specifics of the Narnia story and how they help us to understand the Christian story better, I want us to ask a question that I think Lewis would ask us. What story are we living in? Am I living in? If we were able to have lunch with C.S. Lewis and could ask him all the questions we might want to about the Narnia books or any of his other books, I think he'd stop us and he'd first say, what story are you living in? What story do you tell yourself about the world? Asaph was living in the wrong story. He was telling himself the wrong story about the world, and therefore it changed his life until it affected his life poorly until verse 15 or verse 16 of Psalm 73. And because of that, he didn't understand the world. He had lost hope in God because he was telling himself the wrong story. He needed to see that he was trying to live in the wrong story and hear the true story again. So we can easily tell ourselves the wrong story because we live in a world where there are lots of competing stories. You know, every philosophy of life that someone has, everything they tell themselves about life is some type of story about the world that they're telling themselves. And whatever story they tell themselves is attempting to explain why the world is the way it is, what our purpose is, why humans act the way they do, why bad things happen, why good things happen, how we should live, what's the meaning of life, and where are we going to be going after this life is over. This kind of story has a technical name. It's called a meta-narrative. It's a story that weaves together all of reality, all that we see and around us, all of history, into one coherent story and shows us even where our little stories fit within that. That's a meta-narrative. Now, there are lots of meta-narratives, stories like this in our culture. 500 years ago, even 100 years ago, the Western culture basically had one story, and that was more or less the Christian story. But now that's not the case. We live in a secular society. In fact, but that doesn't mean that people aren't spiritual or religious. That's a false idea of what secularism is, by the way. To live in a secular culture doesn't mean that there's not religion or spirituality. What it means is that there are lots of stories that people can choose from. Some of them are very religious stories to live by. Some of them are very atheistic stories to live by. Our culture has become kind of a buffet of stories. You can pick and choose the story you want. In fact, you can even mix and match them if you want to. That's what it means to live in a secular world. There are many stories about the universe, and the Christian story now has competition. That's a secular world. And as Christians, we can easily pick up bits and pieces from these other stories. So I want to briefly tell you what some of the dominant stories in our culture. And we'll talk more about this kind of stuff on Sunday. First, there's the modernist rationality narrative. It's a story that basically goes like this. This physical world that I'm sitting out under, the sun, all of the things that we see and can feel around us are the only reality, and there is nothing that exists beyond it. Nothing that exists beyond energy and matter. So, everything in this universe, therefore, has a physical cause. So, has physical explanation, even love, feelings, morals, consciousness, spirituality, the existence of religion, all have physical causes. That means that all of our problems have physical causes. If all of our problems have physical causes, then all of our problems can be fixed by technological solutions. So if we want to improve our society, we need to improve our technology and improve our understanding of the universe through science. If we do that, our civilization, our society, our world will improve both socially and morally. This is a story that's been being told ever since the Enlightenment in the early 1700s. Then, sorry about the sound of that big truck. Then there's also the postmodernist narrative. This is the second one. This one says that there's actually not a big story that explains all of reality. So therefore, each individual is free to shape, reshape, create reality with their own stories, by their own desires, whatever they want. So you can write your own story about the universe, however you want it. In fact, this story goes even further because it goes on to say that if someone tries to tell you that there is a big story that encompasses the whole universe and your life, that person is actually attacking you, trying to make you subject and control you by their story. I mean, this story has been told for about the past 80 years or so. Then there's also the story of individualistic progress. In this story, every individual is the center of their own universe, and the purpose of an individual is to continue to progress as best they can. Therefore, society cannot protect or promote one group of individuals. They cannot even promote one set of morals or values, but they are simply there, society is simply there to set all individuals free, to live as they want, to be able to write their stories themselves. And in this story, choice is the most sacred value. And if you are prosperous in this story, well, obviously, you're doing something right. So you're doing a good job of progressing. Then fourthly, the last one I want to mention is there's the victim narrative. In this story, certain individuals are victims in societies of other people's bad choices and the choices in society. And therefore, those individuals, those victims, can and should revolt against society in order to even things out. They are owed something by everyone else because, of course, they've been a victim for so long. Therefore, they are justified in getting whatever they think they're owed by pretty much any means possible. So in this kind of story, there's very little or no personal responsibility. All the bad things in my life are the result of someone else's things, someone else's bad actions against me. My parents, my economic status, my race, my other people's choices or oppression. Now, you might have noticed in each of these four stories that there is a little bit of truth in them, but truth mixed with a lot of lies as well. The devil loves to do that. By mixing a little bit of truth with a lie, the story becomes 100 times more believable. You might have also noticed that these stories can be mixed and matched. They can be. So these are stories that are told to us in news articles and advertisements and books and classes and music and many other ways. So whatever story a person tells themselves will determine how they feel and how they live. That's why Asaph felt so terrible for so long, however long it was. He was telling himself the wrong story, something very similar to the story of individualistic progress and the victim narrative. We have to tell ourselves the right story. We'll talk more about that this weekend. See you then.